If there's one risk people make, we think about reputation being sort of a boardroom topic, or communications being owned by corporate communications or branding. And of course they have a role to play, but actually everybody through the chain, from the top to the bottom, from the left to the right, has this role to play in communicating, setting the brand, helping bring reputation to life. And I think that's therefore a really important observation. Yes, we're multiplayer externally, but we're also multiplayer internally, and how they interact is very powerful.
Welcome to Your Digital Reputation. Here's your host, Roger Christie.
Hello, I'm Roger Christie, founder and principal at reputation advisory Propel, and host of the Your Digital Reputation podcast, where we talk to industry leaders about how trust is built, tested, and scaled in a digital world. Thanks for joining me. Now, the word control keeps coming up in my world. In fact, not long ago on this very show, it was Alex Chapman who likened reputation to holding water. The harder you squeeze, the less you hold. Well, today's conversation pulls even harder on this fascinating thread. My guest is Laurence Stellings, Senior Vice President and Head of Advisory for EMEA and APAC at RepTrak, which recently released its Global 100 study. A key report finding is that reputation is now a multiplayer game, shaped less by the polished, scripted messages we control, and more by what happens in the wild, via internal and external voices we don't. What Laurence and I land on is a practical, evidence-backed playbook for leaders and advisors, one worth considering as we all compete for trust in a sea of AI-generated sameness. Let's bring him in now. So Laurence, I know plenty of our listeners will know about RepTrak or may even use RepTrak. Can you start by telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what your role entails?
So I have the pleasure of heading RepTrak's advisory teams across both Europe and APAC. And what that means is I get to have a great job, actually, of looking at our data, and we collect millions of data points every month of looking at the data, of getting to have conversations with communication practitioners at some of the world's largest companies, and working alongside a really talented team of advisors at RepTrak who help bring our data and all of our experience to life. And so my role is to sit over that and try to coordinate all of that and drive all of that. And it's a really enjoyable role that I say brings together the data, the talking to practitioners, and working with a great team.
Wonderful. And one thing that we've talked about previously, given that broad remit that you have and all the different people that you talk to, one of the things we've chatted about previously is this idea of how communications has shifted over the years. And I know you were saying to me this idea of, communications was something that used to be done to people, not with people. Can you give us a bit of a sense of the research that you've done recently and how it points to this shift in trends?
I think it's worth taking a step back to perhaps the past of communications. And I'll simplify a little bit here, and I don't think it was ever quite this straightforward. But if you go back maybe 30 years, it did feel you were able to communicate to people. We had perhaps a press relations team who issued press releases, and that would give journalists a line to take, and they would perhaps very nicely then go and write about whatever it is we said to write about. We might have had, and we probably didn't call it an employee branding team, but an internal communications team who will tell our employees why they should feel happy to work for us, who will tell our employees what they should feel about a particular topic, and they would go away and fill that. We had an investor relations team maybe who would tell a small number of investors how we were performing, and they would take that message. And that was that idea of doing communications to somebody. And I think I've simplified that a bit. It was never quite that straightforward, but you had quite a large amount of control. You could set a narrative and expect people to take it. And over a long period of time, that's changed. If you think back to maybe even as long ago as the 1990s, the early 2000s, you had the emergence of rolling news, faster news cycles, more media coverage. So you lost some of that control. Then you have the rise of social media, and that changes control slightly because more people are now able to be part of a conversation, and that conversation happens quicker. Even something like the smartphone that gave everybody a high resolution camera or a video recording device. You might remember some of the idea of citizen journalists when that begins to emerge as a concept. And all those trends have continued. And in the last few years, you of course have the rise of AI now, and millions, billions of people around the world using AI to find out about companies, products, and brands. And who really knows how AI models work? That takes away some more of the control. And so all of that is shifting us, I think, from this world where we do communications to people, we tell them what to think, to where, whether we're speaking as individuals or as a corporate or as a not-for-profit or a government, whoever it may be, at best we're communicating with people, not to them. And that comes out really strongly from some of the data we have at RepTrak. We publish every year a global study called the GRT 100, which is a snapshot of the world's largest businesses across all of the world's major economies. And one of the real trends we're seeing this year is what we call multiplayer reputation, but just this idea that you're part of your message, you're part of your story, but you're no longer controlling all your stakeholders, be they your customers, the public, regulators, employees, are also now a really important part of your communications and how your messages, your reputation, your brand is being formed.
And so as I hear that multiplayer word, my mind immediately connects that to what you're describing there in terms of, and I appreciate, no, it's not that simple, but the idea of to versus with. That idea that we are in a way participating as opposed to standing dictating, that the to model, we're participating, that kind of communications with, and everyone has a role to play and a voice in that discussion. And Laurence, as you talk through that, and I do want to get into the Global 100 report in a bit more detail, but as you're talking through that, it kind of reminds me of this analogy that I've used previously when describing the way communications works today, along that line, which is, and bear with me, I'm certainly not a scientist, this is more communications than science, but if you take the solar system as an idea, I mean, there was a point where we thought that the Earth sat at the center of the universe and that everything kind of orbited around us. And obviously, as our own maturity, as our own understanding has changed and developed, we've obviously learned that we'll actually know we're orbiting along with everyone else around the sun. And if you take that kind of change in perception, I feel like it reflects the old way, if you will, of brand communications, where the brand did sit at the center and just passed messages out, as you're saying, to those stakeholders. Whereas now brands have got to realize that we are all in orbit and we all have a voice and we all have the power to influence that conversation. And when you take that mindset, when you shift away from the kind of centralized control and everything else flowing around you based on your needs and your desires, if you flip that around, suddenly it asks a lot of questions about the systems and structures that exist inside organizations today. I don't know what your thoughts are on that kind of model, Laurence.
It does. And it's something that I think will feel scary to people, that you're losing control, but done well, actually, I think it brings some real benefits. Because as you take that traditional model of communicators at the center, you communicate out to each of your audiences, to your regulators, to your customers, to your potential customers, to employees. Actually, what a multiplayer or a more complex environment lets you do is those audiences get to talk to each other. And if you do a really good job with your communications, you find that there are conversations about you that you're not having to start at all, that people just naturally want to talk about you. Now, it's a really high bar, right? None of us have a right to be heard or a right to be interesting. But if you do a good job, you might find that your customers just start actually talking about you spontaneously to other people and talk to a potential customer who's then brought into your world. You might find your regulators like so much what you're doing. They use you as a best practice example. And I think one company that does this really well is Adidas. They're one of the companies that does really well in our ranking this year, but just their approach towards communications is really interesting in terms of using content creators and using influencers, but giving them quite a lot of creative freedom in how they talk about them, and also just having really interesting cultural moments. One of the things I do in my spare time, I'm a runner, not a very good runner, but I enjoy running. And recently at the London Marathon, two athletes, the first time ever, broke the sub 2 hour mark for running a marathon, which is one of those things that for a long time, I think some people have thought was impossible, like beyond human endurance. They've done it, both of them wearing a very expensive modern pair of Adidas shoes. And the conversation that has started, and of course, Adidas's marketing team were right there with, all the high-res promotional shots of the shoes and the athletes holding them up. But just then actually of journalists and amateur runners and sports psychologists talking about that, taking this, or a very tangible moment and making it actually much, much bigger than I think any central marketing or any central communications drive could be. And I think it's only one example, but I think that is the power of that more complex ecosystem or those more complex interactions of if you have a story that's really worth telling, that you're able to go further. And I think that's also one of the key points. In the old world, almost whatever your narrative was, you push that out there. I think in the newer world we live in, there's a real premium on, is your story actually worth talking about? Is this actually interesting content? And I think whether, again, you're looking to communicate for yourself or for a company or a public body, we all sometimes have that frustration. My message isn't reaching who I want to. I'm not getting the cut through. And there are various things you can look at around, why that might be. But often underneath that is a fundamental, is it actually an interesting message? Like, is it an interesting topic I'm trying to talk about? Have I got something unique to say? And nobody really kind of has a right to be heard. You have to, in a very noisy world, in a very busy world, like fight for the right to be heard, to get your message out there. And I think it does put much more importance on, am I saying something interesting? Am I saying something unique? Do I have a particular take here? Or am I, frankly, just noise in this is a very busy environment?
There's an interesting, maybe the word is tension there, Laurence. What I'm hearing from what you're saying there is this idea of, storytelling and having a story worth telling, or certainly a story worth hearing. What's the view in the multiplayer, like with the multiplayer lens on? What is the view around listening? Because not everyone has a story that's worth being listened to, but everyone has the potential to listen to those audiences. And whether it is Adidas or using other examples, are there examples where organizations, by listening to their key audiences, those that they do want to get cut through with, have actually had that paid back to them in spades in developing that multiplayer, collaborative, if you will, approach to storytelling. And that's what's led to that kind of fracture and fragmentation of stories, as opposed to that, brand at the center, command and control.
Yeah, I think the listening point is a key thing. And even more basic than that, just understanding what your audiences are interested in. Like most individuals, companies, charities, public bodies, whoever you may be, you have any number of organized different stakeholders you're dealing with. In an ideal world, they'd all be interested in the same topic, but we know that's not the case, right? They're all interested in different things, they all have different needs. So getting a really in-depth understanding of what those people, whoever those people are, want, need, are interested in is so key, because that's exactly how you do then tailor or link your message to what they want to hear about, what topics they're interested in. I think in an ideal world, and whether that comes from lots of data, individual conversations, just a really strong hunch, and I'd always lean towards more evidence rather than less evidence, but whatever that comes from, it's then finding those overlaps of, this is something my audience is interested in. What are all those things I actually have to talk about, and where are those overlaps? And one of the challenges, I think, for lots of people, there are lots of interesting stories. You think about any large corporate, there are probably 101 interesting things going on inside that business. It's a great employer. They're doing something innovative with AI. There's a new product launch coming. There's improving financial performance, 100 other topics. And where people make mistakes is in trying to talk about all of those things to all of their audiences. Nobody is interested in all of those topics. Nobody has the time or the energy to listen to all of them. So it's often a case of making some quite difficult choices. This is an interesting topic. I'm not going to talk about it. This is a real unique proof point, but it only matters internally, so I won't communicate externally. And finding those overlaps between what individuals are interested in, whoever that audience might be, and actually what the topics you have to talk about, where you have something interesting saying, something credible saying, where that overlap comes from.
So there's something there about the way that I hear the word multiplayer and the way that you were describing it. It sounds like, every stakeholder has a role to play in shaping or refining or appropriating, if you will, the stories that come from within an organization. But as you're describing it there, it feels to me more like there's multiplayers on both sides. Is that right? In the sense that the organization, as a result, you can't have one central brand telling, as you describe it, every single story to every single person, because that's ultimately going to create bottlenecks or fracturing of messages and confusion of messages, let alone the time and capacity issues that you've raised there too. We've got stakeholders on the outside being multiplayer, and the myriad platforms that we have today. And inside an organization, it's also a multiplayer game, because you can't have one single face or entity being the source of all those stories. How does multiplayer play out, both externally and internally?
So one of the things our data tells us really clearly is one of the most trusted sources of information about companies is their ordinary employees. So not the CEO, not the board, not an influencer on LinkedIn. the ordinary frontline member of staff. Let me give you two examples. I took a flight last year to Helsinki with Finnair. Not an airline I've travelled with before, very short European flight, maybe 2-3 hours. And normally, and I'm not a plane expert, but normally they're quite small planes, like one aisle, 6 seats on each side, 3 on each side of the aisle. This was a much bigger plane, much fancier seat. And so I had a brief chat with the cabin crew about, what's different about the plane? And you could tell just this sense of pride and excitement from the cabin crew, that this was normally one of the planes they use for their longer haul flights, but this plane had just been delivered, like in the last month. It still had that kind of new car smell to it. And it was their most up-to-date plane, and they were using it on a few short-haul flights for, just testing it, getting all the crew familiar. And the cabin crew and this person, it was only a 2-minute conversation, but it sticks with me, so passionate, so pointing out a few of the new features that this new plane had arrived. And they were a much, much more effective salesman for me than any long LinkedIn post, any glossy advert, any frequent flyer update, because it wasn't polished, and that's what made it so good. And clearly there'd been a lot of work internally to give people the information on this new plane, but it was delivered with their own personal topics they were interested in, turn of phrase and sparks. It felt like a really authentic thing. And I think it's an important lesson for any brand out there, whether you're a grocery store or an airline or running a call center. If you have frontline staff, they are the tip of the spear, right? They are such strong ambassadors. And I was speaking at a panel event in Europe the other month, and there was the CEO of a local transport company, not an airline, a local transport company. And he was talking with great detail about having the strategy and the vision and all these things that all businesses have, but the need to have that operating across the business. So whether you are the CEO, as he was, or all the way down to an ordinary frontline worker actually driving the mode of transport or cleaning it or setting the timetable, you had that same clarity and passion about why we're here, what do we do, what does good look like for us. And of course, different individuals speak differently, they'll have their own examples. You want that people to be authentic to what it is they do day to day, but actually that everybody can pull that through. And I think often, if there's one risk people make, we think about reputation being sort of a boardroom topic, or communications being owned by corporate communications or branding. And of course they have a role to play, but actually everybody through the chain, from the top to the bottom, from the left to the right, has this role to play in communicating, setting the brand, helping bring reputation to life. And I think that's therefore a really important observation. Yes, we're multiplayer externally, but we're also multiplayer internally, and how they interact is very powerful.
So Laurence, what you got me thinking there, though, and I particularly love that Finnair example as well. It sounds to me like, as part of this multiplayer shift that your research has found, it sounds like particularly employees are moving away from being, distributors of messages or spreaders of messages to being spreaders of belief. It feels like the more a message comes through, not just a kind of an everyday person, but more in everyday language, and language that the audience who they're ultimately talking to will receive and receive well. It sounds like the more natural that is, the more authentic that is, the more effective that message will be. Is that a fair comment to make?
I think so. We often talk about trust in terms of search engines or AI. We know search engines have always looked for sources they deem to be trustworthy. We know when AI finds answers to your questions, it tries to find sources that it thinks are trustworthy or that humans have told it they trust. And those technology platforms do it because it really matters to us as humans. So we all are always naturally looking for someone that we can trust. If you're looking for a tradesperson to do a job at home, you look for signs or evidence that person is trustworthy. And I think rightly or wrongly, but probably rightly, we've all become a little bit cynical about corporate spin or corporate gloss, right? You can detect sometimes quite easily that's the glossy language in a press release. You can detect the CEO who's been through fantastic media training, but nonetheless is perhaps just 1% too polished. Whereas when you talk to, again, ordinary frontline workers, this person at the call center to helping you with a problem with your cell phone contract, the worker in a grocery store on the checkout, or that Finnair cabin crew, you often get something that feels much more authentic. It's not a rehearsed conversation. Different people on that plane have a different conversation. So you're getting a more what will certainly feel like a more authentic conversation and engagement. You get, yes, the corporate line, but with a little bit of personal story, a little bit of personal experience. And I know, again, for companies that can feel concerning, that can feel worrying, like, oh, well, we have a line to take. We don't want people to use that language. There is one option to go down that control route. I think it's ever harder to do. Or there is the option to go, actually, how do we make our employees, our frontline staff, part of our story? What training do we give them? You absolutely need to give them training. Like, again, that Finnair cabin crew person, they clearly had been briefed on the features of the new plane, but they had the freedom and the capability to slightly tailor that to our conversation, to the language we were having, the interaction we had. And it's so powerful. And it's not to say that their advertising is not effective. It's not to say I'm sure their CEO isn't charming in interviews, just that the frontline staff bring a certain something extra to that conversation.
Well, and I think that the reality too is that whether the CEO is charming or not kind of thing, the point is that different people will respond better to different types of people. We all do. We all have people we consider to be more trustworthy based on some kind of common association or familiarity. It might be history, context that we have with that person, and that's not always the top dog. And so I think that's a really important point to call out, is that trust is not something that's delivered through one consistent person. Trust is something that is formed and shaped based on the experiences the receiver has and whether the person delivering that message represents those things or not. You can't just manufacture it out of thin air. So with that idea that you're talking about, and particularly this kind of multiplayer environment, were there correlations with your Global 100 research? Were there correlations between those who seem to manage that well and recognize their role of participation versus those who tried to fight against it and try and control?
Yeah, definitely. I've already spoke about Adidas, who are one of the companies that's most improved this year. Another example I could talk about is Barilla, the Italian pasta company. And actually, it's a really interesting example because often when we talk about communications, we lean towards what we're seeing like very exciting companies, often tech companies. And actually, it's hard to think of something more everyday than dried pasta in your kitchen. And
no, Laurence, my kids would argue that pasta is one of the most exciting things on the planet.
And certainly my colleagues in Milan would make the same case as your kids. But what's interesting about Barilla is they were the top ranked food and beverage company in our ranking this year and have significantly improved. And they are, again, really leaning into this multiplayer idea of conversations. So there are some things they're doing differently. So they've made a bold move into being one of Formula One's major sponsors. Now, big global sport, often associated with luxury, so luxury watches, say, or high-end perfumes, not necessarily dried pasta, but again, they've got some interesting ways in which they're activating that partnership. They're also leaning much more into their Italian heritage, and we all have our own stereotypes of countries around the world. I think if you ask most people, Italy is associated with quite a good lifestyle, good food, good wine, good weather, and they've really lent into that sort of Italian heritage. And then there are some really fun things they do. You know, one of the concerns if your kids are after pasta, how long do you cook the pasta for? How long do you have to cook it for to get the perfect al dente pasta? And to help solve that, they have a whole series of Spotify playlists, one named after each type of pasta. You put the playlist on, and it will help you cook the perfect al dente pasta for that type. So some of them are little 8-minute jazz playlists because it doesn't take long to cook. Some are slightly longer, 17 or 18 minutes. They're all, small examples of what is a slightly different approach. It's not your traditional approach of pasta in a big bag, good value for money, or pasta in a big bag, buy one, get one free. It's a much more creative approach towards talking not just about the product, but actually what it means. It's the meal you have with your children. It's the gathering of friends together. It's something that brings work colleagues together. It's the shared experience. And I think that's another nice example of a company, perhaps not in the most exciting sector, taking advantage of this sort of multiplayer approach to, yes, directing some of the conversation, but also leaving some of it open to people. What you do with the playlist, how you cook the pasta, who you gather around your Italian table to share in the meal.
And I think that, and also the local transport operator example you gave earlier, I think with all of them, what they seem to talk to is this idea that scripting isn't actually a constructive process here. Scripting in that sameness that you talked about, when something feels polished, when something feels contrived, we spot it, we smell it, and we kind of reject it. We don't like that idea. Whereas in those situations, it sounds like giving, and we're talking specifically about staff here by the sound of it, but I assume this applies across different stakeholder groups as well. When we give those stakeholders, when it's staff in this case, something to talk about, we give them clarity of the mission, which was something you mentioned earlier, which I think is really important and powerful. When we explain where we're heading and why, but we allow them to interpret that in a way that they know they will communicate and can land with their audiences, that's far more effective than scripting. And so, Laurence, as you were describing it earlier, that idea that people might find this uncomfortable, this idea of kind of multiplayer, an uncomfortable concept as opposed to the kind of brand controls that we have. Are we getting to the point now where if we try and hold on too tight, a bit like Alex Chapman said in our recent conversation on this show, the tighter we try to hold on to control, the more things slip through our grasp. And it actually is a sensible and smart and certainly strategically viable approach to support and embrace this multiplayer environment.
I think people have always been good at, as I said earlier, spotting inauthenticity. Before I did lots of corporate work, I worked as a political opinion pollster in politics. And one of the things that I think voters are great at doing, not always with like great amounts of evidence or sophistication, there is sort of seeing someone speak or reading someone and very quickly getting a sense of, are they broadly meaning what they're saying? Or like, are they kind of lying is a strong term, but are they lying or spinning here? Or actually, that's not what they really believe. And people, I think as humans, we're remarkably good at reading that sentiment. And the same is absolutely true in the corporate or the business world, right? You very quickly get a sense, whether that's you as an employee, as a customer, as a policymaker, of this is a business which is telling me the truth and this leader is being pretty fair and honest, or there's something going on here. This isn't a complete story. And again, I'm not saying it was easy in the past to get away with it. I think it was easier than it is now to get away with those things. And as I say, your previous guest was saying, it gets ever harder now to maintain those things because there are just more ways to be found out. The media pays more attention and scrutinizes. AI finds all sorts of old references or oddities and can surface those. And your customers through social media networks or just real world conversations talk about these things. And for companies pretending great customer service and a premium product, you get found out really quickly when it turns out it's not those things and that's not the lived experience, and people see those gaps and it really harms you when that happens.
So I'm really pleased you've called that out because look, one of the most recent and obvious examples, of course, is how quickly people associate the M- with AI generated content. Now, it's not that there's anything wrong with the M-, but obviously it's a convention and there are other it's not this, it's that kind of formulas that people have become accustomed to. This isn't something that's been in our lexicon in the way that we prepare communications for decades. This is something that people have identified the patterns very quickly on. We see those things, we sniff those things out, and when we see them and when they're presented as disingenuous, that's where the problem comes from. But there's perhaps a maybe slightly more subtle thing there, Laurence, that I want to drill into in a little bit more detail here, in that idea of multiplayer. And it goes to what you were saying before about, those unscripted messages. I've become quite fond, I suppose, of this phrase called "in the wild," and it's when there's, the brand handcuffs on in the worst case scenario, something is very controlled and very contrived, versus a message that's out there in the wild, and it's being experienced by people without the same polish, without the same production value behind it. And that's where things are really tested and appropriated and so on, and they take on a life of their own. And what's interesting about these two different worlds, if we take the polished example that you've talked about, the controlled and contrived, as you said, people can smell that. That's okay. That's, as in, if that's your approach, people ultimately will start to increasingly become detached from the message and start to lose trust in the messenger. Come over to in the wild though, and this is what's really interesting in what we've seen in our data. We have seen examples where CEOs, when executives who are out there in the wild, without the polish, without the script, without any of the production value, when they turn up in the wild and when they're just sharing from the heart and sharing something in response to something someone else has done, the response to that is phenomenal. And the belief, as you were saying before, that comes through this unscripted message is like nothing any of their other institutional messages could possibly generate. And it's simply because it's reactive. It's because it is unscripted by its very nature. It is not brand-led. And so you've got this world over here with the polished and scripted, and you've got this world over here, what's happening in the wild. one interesting trend that's emerging is not only this versus this, but how they're held together. And I think this is maybe a watch for people listening today. When we talk about this idea of multiplayer, we're not saying do this and be polished and have everyone nice, orderly, copying and pasting the message out there, simply just have more people doing it. And we're not saying go completely off script and have this completely ungoverned Wild West environment, because the risk here is that all organizations have a degree of polish. And when you start to go out in the wild and you do get that, you build that connection and trust in a more organic and reactive way, people start coming back and looking at the scripted messages. And so they can suddenly see the contrast between the two. And that's where real risk exists. We can't on Monday be scripted and on Tuesday be natural. We have to find a way to take what is an otherwise scripted message and appropriate it for our audiences. And that's the challenge. And that's why I love that example you give of the CEO explaining the mission to their people and their people taking that and appropriating that, because that's what we should be controlling. We should be controlling the way that we communicate the journey we're going on. And we should trust our people to be able to take that message. Now that they get it, now they get the journey and they understand their role in that journey, we should be trusting them to take it to their networks, to their communities, in words that they will understand and that will resonate.
Yeah, and it's getting the balance of those. One of the things I enjoy doing in my free time, personal time when I'm at work, live music, love going to live concerts and gigs. Now, if you want just to listen to the best version of your favorite band, your particular song, you actually don't go and do that at a live. Like, you're never going to get every note hit, get quite the right everything as you would in the recorded version, but you gain something else from the live version. And I think it is that balance of how much are you an artist that relies on streams and the recorded version, how much, what's the live show? And I think that, and we've seen, in the last couple of years, this huge explosion in live music as actually the scripted, to take the analogy a step further, the scripted version, the version you get on Spotify or Apple Music, the perfectly recorded version is ubiquitous, is available everywhere, the world's music in your smartphone, right? And we all have that. It makes the live version with the unexpected cover, the guest performer, the slightly different version of a song that they do, all the more exciting, all the more sort of something you seek out. And I think you see something similar in communications, right? There is always a role for the scripted, and there will be some communication things which have to be scripted. You are sending your CEO to give evidence in front of a congressional or parliamentary inquiry. I want that CEO following a script and having been carefully briefed and getting legal advice. If you're doing investor relations days, there are regulatory market-moving things. You're going to have some set pieces. And I think and I don't want people to come away from this thinking, well, everything has to be free form. No, of course, there'll be a set piece. But it is also then acknowledging what are the times when it might be appropriate to actually show some of the human behind the company. If we have had a crisis or a scandal, I imagine your CEO and your ELT is pretty upset by that. Letting a little bit of that actually show to get that idea that they are personally upset or offended or disappointed by this. If there is a new product launching, it doesn't have to. I imagine lots of people have worked very hard inside. It's been years of hard work and investment. Let some of that excitement show. Don't just have the glossy language. And it's not all of one or all of the other. It is finding that balance. And of course, that balance will vary. And this is where it's difficult. Will vary company by company. You were asking earlier about not just talking what to stakeholders, what do audiences want to hear. That will vary. It may well be the financial community has a relatively small appetite for free-form, unscripted conversation. It may well be some audiences want to hear a lot from you of that. So getting that balance right, I think, is the key to being an effective communicator. What's the natural tone? What's the right message for each of the different occasions and the different audiences in which you're talking to?
And if I can bring in another source of global research, Laurence, that I think complements what you're saying beautifully. The Edelman Trust Barometer has obviously been running for years now, decades even. What I love about the Edelman research and how it backs you up is this idea that we all have trust brokers. So these aren't necessarily the most senior voice in the room. They're not necessarily the most expert voice in the room. But these are people who have a connection between an audience and an idea. They will inherently know which channels are the right channels because they're part of those communities. They will inherently know which issues are going to land and which issues are going to cause a flare-up because they're immersed in those communities. And so I love when you bring these two worlds together, you've got a very powerful playbook for modern communicators and those who are advising executives to say, here's the reality. It's what RepTrak is saying in terms of the multiplayer environment. And here's a way that we can go about engaging our people and building that connection with audiences, not through one voice, but through that coalition, if you will, of trust brokers who should and are better placed to engage those different audiences.
Yeah, it reminds me of some work I did with a major grocery store, and they made a shift from always using or at least for some of their coverage, always using your classic C-suite to actually topic expert. So it could be an ordinary store manager. It could be the lead buyer for a particular product line. And they had great success with that simply because it's difficult sometimes for the C-suite to pretend they understand all of the issues. Of course they don't. They're dealing with such a wide range of stuff. An ordinary store manager can talk about value or freshness of produce because they interact with customers on a day-to-day basis. If you have a lead buyer for a particular product line, they just have that depth of knowledge that comes through, that passion, that authenticity, that sort of library of examples that come through. And that, I said earlier about people spot inauthenticity. Can't fake that. Like when you know a community, when you know a product line, when you know a subject, your knowledge, your interest, your passion, comes across so strongly, and people are really good at spotting when you don't have that.
And with that in mind, Laurence, what are some of the, if you look at what the research tells you, your own experiences, those conversations with clients in industry, what would you say are some of the best practices here? What does good, if not best practice, look like for people, given this new world we're living in?
I think the challenge for lots of people is there's so many things they want to talk about. You end up talking a little about too many things. And so there is the genuinely and sincere post about what you're doing for Pride Month. There's the genuine sincere post about what we're doing for Earth Day, about the new apprentices or graduates you've hired. You go through 12 different messages in a month. And actually, it's really hard to land any of those because even an attentive listener is or an attentive reader comes away thinking, well, you're doing a little of a lot. But most people are not attentive. Like, we have no right to people's attention. Or even if we think we do have a right, we are one of 100 companies, 100 communicators trying to get people's attention. So one way to cut through in that is just to be really disciplined and consistent, choosing, as I said, those couple of topics that you want to be known for. And that will mean choosing some things you're not going to talk about, but choosing those things you want to be known for and being really consistent in communicating with that. And it doesn't mean repeating the same story all of the time. It could be there are new ways of illustrating the topic, but knowing those couple of things that I as an individual, I as a company, I as a politician want to be known for these couple of things. And I'm going to talk about those things over and over again to get that cut through and get people to remember.
And so, Laurence, you're immediately making me think of, again, another guest we've had on this podcast, the Honourable Victor Dominello. And when you talk about a politician who uses these channels to be known for a certain issue and their dedication to addressing the issue and the pain points associated with that issue, particularly in the APAC region, he's someone that immediately comes to mind, having that consistency. And it wasn't consistency in terms of the same stories as you're saying, but it was a commitment to the issue. And so you knew if that issue came up, and I would argue this is the measure of success. If someone else was having a conversation about a topic that he was very passionate about in a completely different part of the internet, so to speak, his tribe or the people that were equally interested in those issues would tag him and invite him into conversation and say, hey, either FYI, this will be of interest to you, or I'm sure you're going to have an opinion on this. And so suddenly you're working in unison. And that is that idea of, again, of that multiplayer word that you've brought into today's conversation and that's come through your research so beautifully. That's a perfect example for me of consistency lived out there in the everyday. Nuance is the thing that I keep coming back to here. But the thing that underpins that nuance, Laurence, what I've heard from you today is this idea of the reality of the multiplayer universe we're living in today. And it is perhaps foolish, and they're my words, not yours, but it's perhaps foolish to suggest that we can exist in this place that will always be controlled and where we can always dictate terms, or where we will always be the keepers of the message and make sure that they're distributed outwards, because there is so much nuance and complexity in that multiplayer environment. So I'm so thankful that you've taken the time to share not only the insights and the wisdom from the report itself, but also some of those really practical examples and takeaways for people today. So Laurence Stellings, thank you so much for being part of the Your Digital Reputation podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for listening. If you've learned something from today's conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others. For all show notes, head to propelgroup.com.au. Thanks again for listening.